It is my pleasure to introduce His Excellency Minister Omar Al-Ulama. Omar Sultan Al-Ulama is the Minister of State for Artificial Intelligence in the United Arab Emirates. He was appointed in October 2017 by the Vice President, Prime Minister of the UAE and ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum. Your Excellency, it's such an honor to have you with us. We very much greatly appreciate you taking time to speak to the Israel Industry 4.0 Global Leaders Summit. You're definitely the first and the only, so far, Minister of Artificial Intelligence in the world. It must be a very complex task to coordinate the activity of such a core technology on the society, and yet you have recently unveiled the long-term AI strategy. Can you please describe your vision of this strategy and what are the policies that will help UAE achieve the goals of this strategy?
Thank you very much for the introduction. It's an absolute pleasure and honor being with all of you here today, albeit virtually. I hope that we will be able to meet physically in the near future and take this forward with regards to the collaboration between the UAE and Israel. With regards to why this mandate was created, let's go back to the early 20th century and the late 19th century with the advent of electricity, automobiles, telecommunications, and the end of the first industrial revolution. What we see is that there are many posts that, if they were created back then, would have been seen as odd. So if you had at that point of time ministers of electricity, it would have been seen as odd. But today we have ministers of energy. If you had ministers of telecommunications, it would have been seen as odd because the technology was still very, very primitive at the time. If you had ministers of transportation as well, it would have been seen as something that is more or less acceptable. But if you talked about ministers of aviation, people would have thought about it as being a very futuristic outlook that might not be necessarily true. Fast forward 50 years, it became necessary. So all countries actually went and appointed ministers of energy, ministers of telecommunications, ministers of ICT, ministers of aviation, so on and so forth. And we see that these ministers are critical to ensure that we develop these technologies and deploy them in the rightful manner across countries. So we see the different reports and different intellectual leaders talking about the importance of AI, but unfortunately there isn't enough appetite globally to actually go and do something about it and have someone that leads this mandate across government. Why it's important is because government is going to be affected by AI. We see things happening across academia and across the private sector that trickle down to government and change the way governments do business. It's a matter of time. And we do believe that customer expectations changes because of the way that the private sector does certain things. So the private sector today uses AI to give you more tailored services, to be more proactive, to create an experience unlike any other. We do believe that government needs to go through this transformation as well. If we think about the way that the government works, there are many different verticals. So there's the economic vertical, there's a social vertical, there's a security vertical, and all of them are going to be touched by AI in one way, shape, or form. Some of them are going to be negative, some of them are going to be positive. So it is imperative for us as governments to not just look at this technology as something that's nice to have, but something that needs to be regulated from the negative and needs to be invested in from the positive. And as governments, we need to work with the private sector, we need to work with each other to ensure that we reap the rewards while at the same time overcoming the challenges. In the UAE, our leadership actually started investing in technologies and investing in this many years before. So in the early 2000s, His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, Vice President, Prime Minister, and ruler of Dubai, at that time he was the Crown Prince of Dubai, said that we need to look at investing in e-government. At the time where the internet was still quite new, computers were being introduced, but people were not sure about the future of computers in the workplace. And he put a very ambitious strategy to move from a paper and cabinet-based government to an electronic government. There were a lot of naysayers back then who believed that this will fail. And a few years later, so 5 years after launching that strategy, His Highness went and said, we need to move towards an internet government where all services are available online, where we are able to access certain government details and databases online, so on and so forth. Beyond that, he looked at M-government. And then in 2015, he pushed strongly towards smart government. All of these were the foundations, because if you want to jump into AI, all of a sudden, it will take you years to change the legacy systems into systems that are AI ready. But if you make the right investments over a period of time, you will be able to reap this reward without actually going through a complete revamp of government, which is the benefit that allowed me to be able to do my job better. And I do believe that it's that vision that helped create the movement that made the UAE a leader in AI today.
Thank you. It's actually, when I had the privilege of visiting Dubai a couple of months ago for a few days, I was very impressed of how the government of United Arab Emirates is thinking strategically, very long term, and making investments that are not necessarily warranted by today's challenges, but will open the platforms for the future. So this is not surprising that in every AI ranking that ranks countries, United Arab Emirates is ranked very highly in terms of all the parameters that are related to policy and government activities, whether it's infrastructure, operational environment, government strategy. Israel, unfortunately, is not very highly rated in those regards, but we do have strength in R&D and its commercialization. So it turns out that two of our countries are highly complementary in terms of our relative strengths, which means that the collaboration can be very fruitful. So I would like to ask you, where do you see Israeli AI companies, in whether it's in health or mobility or fintech and other sectors that you've mentioned, being useful in achieving the UAE AI goals, and how should they go about connecting to UAE strategy entities and the vision?
That's a very interesting point that you raise, and I'm going to look at it in a few different facets. The first is there is a undeniable need for us to collaborate. This is a fact because of the nature of our countries. We are medium-sized countries together. We have a lot of innovation. We have a lot of positive outlook towards the future, but unfortunately, we cannot compete with the big giants globally. So the only way for us to actually have a seat on the table and to make sure that we can push forward in certain files or mandates is for us to work together. So to get the Emirati view on AI, to get the Israeli view on AI, we need to be working closely together to ensure that the bigger players actually take that seriously. The second is our markets are not that big. So if you're thinking about AI companies in Israel or AI companies in the UAE, if they cater to these local markets, I think it's always going to be a challenge for them to scale up and continuously be able to grow and compete with the big giants. But if we work together and open up our markets and open up as well surrounding markets and global markets for each other, the way that the UAE is a hub, for example, today for the Middle East, for Africa, for India, and for Asia as well, and the way that Israel today is one of the go-to countries when it comes to European and American, for example, tech investments and tech scalability as well to scale up. If we come together, we can dominate the world. It makes the markets much bigger. It makes it a lot more appealing. And it also allows us to be able to create systems and to be able to create companies in these two countries that are able to compete with the big giants and become giants on their own. The second facet of this, or the second vertical, is the fact that there are strengths in the UAE that Israel can benefit from, and there are strengths in Israel that the UAE can benefit from. And here I'd like to use an example of India, which we have something called the AI bridge between the UAE and India, which we signed a few years back. And the reason why we've signed it is India came to us and said, look, we have a lot of bureaucracy. We have a huge government, but it is necessary because of the number of people that live in this country. But we are very interested in your governance model. How can we work together? So what we decided is, why don't you come and deploy your technology in the UAE if we both agree that this is a positive technology that we want to push forward? We then will change our policies and regulations fast enough to allow you to deploy it, see the impact, and you can take that impact back home and convince your stakeholders in India that this makes sense to deploy in India. So we become the test bed for India. I do believe that the strengths of being an agile government, the strengths of having 200 nationalities, so the diversity of the population in the UAE, will allow for Israeli companies to do a lot more and to also move a lot faster. And at the same time as well, it's important for us to take our talent in the UAE and to take the ideas that we have in the UAE and to take the different requirements that we have and bring them to Israel and develop them further with your talent in Israel for a win-win situation. Finally, if we look at AI is built on 3 V's, based on any way that you think about it. It's based on the velocity of data that comes to it, so how fast the data that comes in is, the variety of data, so how less bias you have compared to other places, and the volume of data, so the amount of data that you have. These 3 V's show that the UAE is today one of the best markets when it comes to artificial intelligence. We have the velocity because of all the systems that are currently there. All our infrastructure is smart. The investments that were made over the years allow us to have access to data very quickly. The variety of data is there because we have 200 nationalities, and any system you launch here becomes truly global compared to a very homogeneous system based in certain countries. And then finally, when you talk about volume, in certain sectors, we have the highest volume of data. In aviation, for example, our airlines travel to over 177 destinations around the world. That was pre-COVID. But they will, indefinitely or definitely post-COVID go to at least 150 destinations. If you think about logistics, today our logistics companies, port operators, operate over 70 ports around the world. So the amount of data that we have is the holy grail of data when you look at volume and variety and velocity. And I think that the UAE and Israel can work together and actually make use of them to create the next unicorns, the next big giants when it comes to leading these fields.
Thank you, and it's actually quite amazing because what you've described is come to us, make us your better site. Let's develop things together, and then we scale to the world is a great initiative, and I think that many Israeli companies would be very, very interested in that proposition. And Startup Nation Central, which is an organization, a non-profit organization that that is dedicated to promoting positive impact of Israeli innovation on the world, we can be partners with your office to facilitate that connectivity. We would be very, very excited and honored to serve in that capacity. Now, today, the audience of our virtual I4 Global Conference contains many founders that use AI extensively when they digitize the physical assets. So in your case, for example, logistics and airlines, industry, mining, which are all relevant to AI, in order to drive operational efficiency, resilience, while at the same time increasing the sustainability and the flexibility of the processes. What is your advice to them, to the companies specifically in that sector, on how to establish collaborative efforts with the UAE potential partners, as well as going outside of UAE with the help of UAE companies and entities to, as you said, to conquer the world together? Who are the most likely partners?
So what I would say first and foremost is, in the UAE, there is a saying that our leadership used to say, which is, if you're going to come to invest, there is a high likelihood that you're going to succeed because this is a business-friendly environment. And business-friendly environment is what the UAE is about. This is why a lot of companies from around the world choose the UAE as their hub when it comes to expanding beyond their countries into this region and beyond. So I do believe that any endeavor to expand to the UAE or to work in the UAE is going to definitely support you. The second thing that I'm going to say is the COVID pandemic has shown us that the world is changing completely. What's currently happening is our entities globally are becoming a lot more agile. People are closing down offices and moving virtual, or people are keeping their offices but are hiring people virtually from around the world. And they're also trying to move much more aggressively with regards to deployment. So what I would recommend is come to the UAE, look at the needs that are here and beyond the UAE. So look at the needs that are in Africa, look at the needs that are in India, look at the needs that are in the Middle East, and then use the UAE as your entrance to these markets. A simple example for why a lot of multinationals, Fortune 500 companies, choose the UAE to do their business for the region is sometimes they say, for example, we don't know if we can trust other countries or we can actually trust to make the investment to open up our offices to go there because of the business environment, the political environment. Certain countries, they don't have the political stability, but you're able to get that in the UAE. So that is the guarantee that the government gives you. Beyond that, there are a lot of trade shows that happen here that are truly global. So trade shows that bring in people from east to west, the whole world comes together, and you're able to come and see what is to offer there, and you're also able to go and present what is right for you to present for the world at that conference as well. So I'll give you an example. A few years back, actually last year, we launched something called AI Everything. AI Everything, the whole notion behind it, why it was created, was we wanted to do an event where we bring in AI solutions, AI experts around the world to tell us what is going on. The outcome of that was really interesting because we expected it to be a small event that grows with time. With the first year, we had over 10,000 attendees. This was pre-COVID. We had Chinese and American companies, European companies all come together in a time where Chinese companies were not allowed to go to the US companies were not allowed to go to China, and there was this tech war between both China and the US. But AI Everything became the meeting ground for them. It became the meeting ground for the scientists. It became the place where everyone was presenting on equal ground. And it became a huge success, one of the biggest events on AI in the region and in the world as well. We do believe that coming to participate in these gatherings is definitely going to give you the edge, because I think that the technological side of Israel is really interesting. It's really advanced. And it's also going to allow you to see what's happening around the world that you can compete with or complement or work with as well.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you so much for your time. I look forward to coming to Dubai and perhaps meeting and developing closer connections together, so we can definitely work together to help our countries become much more dominant in the world in terms of AI and its application to solving all kinds of challenges. Thank you so much.
I look forward to it. Thank you. Thank you very much.